Hi everyone, this is going to be a video about how to make parts for KSP using the free program Blender. Now, I am by no means a Blender expert. There's a lot of different ways to do the same things, and I've only scratched the surface in what Blender is capable of doing. So I've discovered a variety of techniques and tricks that work with a pretty good workflow for what I need to do, but like I said, by no means am I an expert or is this the only way to do things. So there's a lot of different preferences about how to go about it. So I'm going to show you some tricks and some techniques that just work for me. Um, Now we're going to try to make a sample fuel tank because that's pretty simple, and we can work with that to show you how I do things when I work with Blender. I know when I was getting started with modding in Blender, there was very little information out there about how to do these kinds of things, and I've constantly picked up little tricks to make the workflow go faster and easier, and I'm going to try to share that. Now I'm going to go really fast so that this video doesn't get too long. I'm going to move quickly, but I'm going to try to explain what I'm doing as I go. Now when you first fire up Blender, you'll see a view very much like what you see here, an empty field and a variety of windows and menus off to the sides. In the bottom pane, I like to split it up into two separate panes so that there's an animation timeline here. We're not going to animate this part, but I like to have that handy for when I do. And I make this other viewport do the UV mapping. So you'll come in here, you'll just see UV image editor. I'm sorry, not UV image editor. There's the, yes, that's actually is correct, yes. It's been a while since I've had to configure it. Anyway, up in the main viewport here, it's just in the normal editing mode. You'll go back and forth between object and edit. And over on the right, we have information about the hierarchy of the objects that are in your object that you're building. And there are some options in here that we'll be playing with later after we start building some things. Now I also like to keep this additional tab open that has the availability of the 3D cursor and some transform information that will appear here when we have things selected. You just simply press N to toggle that on and off. And the toolbar on the left, you can toggle that on and off with the letter T. We're going to keep that on most of the time as well. So to get started, since we're making a fuel tank, obviously one of the first things we want to do is start with a simple primitive of a cylinder. So while we're in this mode here, you can select something if you want up here. It doesn't matter. I'm going to deselect both the camera and the lamp. You'll see these little eyeball icons here. I'm turning those off, and I'll explain why later. But then we need to go over on the left side here and click Create, and we're going to go to a cylinder. Now, until we've finalized this cylinder, we can still make some changes to it. And you'll notice on the left here we can make some choices. The first thing we want to do is give it 24 vertices. This is the standard in KSP for all cylindrical parts, even all the way up to 3.75 meter and all the way down to 0.625 meter. All of those parts are generally 24-sided. Some of the 0.625 meters break away from that and have only 16 or 18 faces, but not all of them do. So we're going to try to be consistent, and we want our parts to mesh up nicely with parts made by other modders as well as the stock parts. Now this is going to be a 1.25 meter tank, so the radius is half that, 0.625. We'll just type that in the box here. And you'll find that in Blender, more often than not, we can type numbers, even when you're doing things that seem more mouse-driven. You can still type numbers to correspond to what you're doing, and we'll get to that later too. Now the depth of it, I'm just going to make this a 1 meter tall tank. So this will be very simple. Now while we're still in object mode, you'll see that here, I'm going to go up to the Tools tab, and I'm going to hit Smooth. And you'll see that that smooths this out, and we don't see the individual faces anymore. However, we get some funky things happening around the edges here and some strange artifacts with how the shadows lay on this. So the first thing we want to do is go over to the right here, go to the little wrench icon where we want to add a modifier, and we're going to hit Edge Split. The default of 30 degrees in here is probably fine, although you can change that as needed. I find more often than not somewhere in the value of 30 to 45 degrees works very well. And you'll see what that did is it gave us a nice sharp edge along the top and bottom of our cylinder. The cylinder has nice flat surfaces and it's nice smooth curvature inside. Now there are some times where this still fails you and you may need to work with that, and we'll get to that as well. So now you can simply press the tab key and this will put us into edit mode, and you'll see that it's selecting by vertices right now. However, I prefer to select by faces most of the time. So we're going to start with face selection, and I'm going to leave this set for the pivot point being on the 3D cursor, and we're going to check in this pane over here to make sure that the 3D cursor is set to the origin. And this is, again, very important, and we'll get to that in a moment. So now what I want to do is I want to make some interior detail to this fuel tank. So I'm going to select the top here, use the right mouse button to select it. And what I'm going to do is, because we're going to start shaping here, I'm going to extrude. So I hit E, and right away it puts you into this mode where you can change the Z position of this new extrusion. However, I don't want to do this, so I'm going to hit escape to escape out of the repositioning. And instead, I want to simply scale this. So I'm going to hit S to scale, and I'm going to type in 0.9, enter. Now you'll see this did something I didn't want it to do. It has scaled inward on all 3 planes. Now there's 2 ways to get around this. I can either switch this back to editing around the median point instead of the 3D cursor, or now I'm going to hit Control Z to undo what I just did. What I can do is hit S to scale again, but I'm going to hit Shift Z. Now what that's done is it's constrained the scaling to exist in everything but the Z axis. If I had just hit Z by itself, it would scale only in the Z axis, but I hit Shift Z, so it's going to scale in everything but the Z axis. So once again, I'm going to hit 0.9, enter, and there what we've done is we've created this rim, and we're going to UV map that to texture a rim texture on here that perhaps has little holes or something. So now what we're going to do is we're going to extrude again. This time I do want to move along the Z axis, which it is selected for me, and I'm going to hit -0.1, and you'll see that this has gone down and it's left a raised rim around the outside by taking the panel and moving it downward. Now I'm going to make a curved dome in here, so I'm going to extrude again. E, I'm going to move up by maybe half the distance, 0.05, enter. But I'm also going to scale it. Scale, shift, which is S, Shift Z, and I'm going to say 0.8. And look at that, it's moved inward quite a bit. Now I'm going to extrude again, E, and I'm going to move up by 0.025, S, and then I'm going to say 0.5. Oops, I just hit escape to escape out of that. I'm going to scale it again, S, Shift Z, and I'm going to say 0.5 to make it half the diameter. Press enter, and it's done. And that quickly we have a dome in here. That was very quick and easy. Now how do we go about UV mapping this? And we'll get to that in a second here. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that first before I go and copy this dome to the underside. So I want it to look the same from both ends, but it's easier if we do all of the modifications needed to one end first and then copy it. So what I'm going to do is come in here, and now I still have that center panel selected, and if I didn't have it selected, if I hit A to deselect all, by the way, A selects or deselects all as needed. So what I'm going to do is select the center, I just right click on it. Now I can hit Control and the numpad's plus key. I can hit that twice and it will simply select out 2 layers from where I was. Now I'm going to UV map this. I'm going to go to this middle tab on the left, and you'll see that there are UV mapping commands in here. I'm going to simply select the one at the top, Unwrap, that does this most simplistic unwrap possible. And here we are. We have a big circular unwrap. Now I'm going to scale it down a little bit and just move it out of the way for the moment. Everything that you unwrap will appear in the center, so I tend to move things to the side until I'm ready to work with it. Now that we have something unwrapped, though, what I'm going to do is open our texture, which we're just simply going to use an example from Fuel Tanks Plus. We could just go to Open Image, and what I'm going to do is I already had the URL on the clipboard here, so I just simply paste that in here. And I say URL, but it's just a path for a directory. And in fact, actually, this was not the texture I wanted. I'm going to go into the size 1 folder. And what's great about this is that you can open Photoshop PSD files directly. So I usually do a two-step process of making a texture and then making a second copy of that texture that has the specular alpha channel on it. But because the alpha channel is often interpreted as transparency rather than specularity, you end up with a mostly transparent texture if you use that copy. So I use the working copy of my texture, and you can see here it is. And here is the dome that we want to use. So what I'm going to do is grab this selection here. Now, once again, if you don't have things selected, you can either select all, or in this case, what I want to do is, let's say this is completely deselected, I can hit B to do a box select, and then you just click and drag with the left mouse button. Or, actually, instead of B, you can hit C, which creates a circular selection, and you can use the mouse wheel to select the size of it, and then you just hit the left mouse button to click what you want, and hit the right mouse button to make the circle go away. Now that we have it selected, we use the G key to move things, which I neglected to mention earlier. We press G and we can move this around wherever we want to do with it. Now if I move this, what I'm going to do is just center it over that portion of the texture. And in fact, you can use the mouse button, or not, I'm sorry, the center mouse, the scroll wheel, to do the zoom here so you can get in as close as you need to see what you're doing. I'll fine-tune this a little bit better. I'm going to center it. And then just like with our 3D view, I can scale this by hitting S, and then I can free scale it with the mouse, or I can punch in a number. In this case, I'm going to free scale it because I don't know exactly what percentage to change it by, but I'm going to make it just fit inside the texture here. Now we'll probably have to rotate this later too, because you'll notice the vertices of this are aligned so that this circular unwrap could fit as large as it could within your texture. And so it puts flat edges along the top, bottom, and sides. But in reality, to correspond to what our model is doing, we need the vertices to be aligned to the cardinal directions rather than edges. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at our model here, and I'm going to flip this momentarily into texture paint. And you'll see that according to our cardinal directions here, the texture is rotated wrong. Now it's only off by about, I don't know, 30 degrees maybe. I can hit Tab to go back to edit mode. And while I've got the mouse over this portion here and I've still got the thing selected, I can hit R to rotate. Now I know that because this is 24 faces, that every single one of these faces is 15 degrees across. The first thing I'm going to do is rotate by hitting R and then 7.5. And the reason why I'm doing 7.5 is that it's rotated so that we at least have edges along these cardinal directions, and so therefore we have vertices at the points here. Now once again I'm going to hit Tab, and I'm going to see that, yes, you see it's rotated by about 30 degrees. So what I'm going to do is hit R and rotate by 30. Now I might have rotated it in the wrong direction. And yeah, it looks like I did. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit R and rotate by another 30. And if I look, that's pretty good. Now I don't get too picky about which way is up as long as it's aligned here. This may matter more later if you have something that the texture needs to face a certain direction, in which case you just rotate it as you need to. Now once again I'm going to come in here. I'm going to hit Tab to go back to edit mode. Now what I want to do is I want to capture the rim. Now there's a couple of different ways that we can capture the rim to unwrap it. I'm going to hit A to unselect, and now I can select everything. One thing that I can do is, if you notice here, I can, by the way, to rotate this view, all I'm doing is holding down the middle mouse button and moving the mouse. To zoom, I do the same thing, but I do the Control key and the middle mouse button, and then you can move the mouse forward and back to zoom in and out. And Likewise, if I hold down Shift and hold down the middle mouse button, then I can translate around with the mouse. So this allows me to position the camera as needed. And I can get in close, and what I can do is line up the edge here so that it is completely hidden behind 1 pixel row. I can hit B to do a box select and try to select only that top layer. And then now when I roll back, you see I got almost everything. Now if I hold down Shift and right click on additional quads, I can add them to the selection. Holding down Shift adds it and removes from the current selection, whereas if I didn't hold down Shift, it would select only the one thing I clicked on. Now that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to simply start by selecting one, and then hold down Control and click on others, and it will try to grab everything between the last selection and the new thing that you're clicking on. Now I have to go around in a few steps when I do it that way, and the reason why is because if I try to go from one side to the other too quickly, it shoots across the middle instead of going around the rim like you want. So instead I am going to select around the rim in smaller quantities, and it doesn't take too long to get all of what I want. So now that that is selected, once again, I'm going to come in here, and you'll see that it has lost its association with our texture. This is going to happen from time to time when you're building new meshes. So once again, I'm going to come in here and lost the folder that I was in. So I'll just select that again. And we're going to go over to the left here. We're still in the correct menu. I just need to get to Unwrap, and once again we're doing just a simple Unwrap. Now here's an additional tricky part, because what I want to do is, you see in the upper right of the texture here, these 2 little holes in this panel. This is the texture that I want duplicated all the way around the rim of this fuel tank. So I want every single one of these quads to use exactly the same portion of the texture. So what we're going to do is hit A to unselect everything. I'm going to hit B to box select, and I'm going to select the right side of this ring and the one at the bottom here. So I have exactly half of them selected. Now what I'm going to do also is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to hit the little magnet icon, which is for the snap. We want to move things with a snap to. First thing we're going to do is hit Y to detach these polygons from the others. We're going to hit R180, enter, to rotate it by 180 degrees. And now that it's rotated, if I hit G and move but first I'm moving my mouse over to here, hit G, and the panel, all of these polygons snap to the position that my mouse is at, relative to whatever the other quads here are. So now I'm going to hit A to deselect, and A again to select all. Actually, I'm sorry, not all. Hit A to just deselect everything. I'm going to box select the bottom half. Y, R, 4, 5. See, now I'm making mistakes. I'm getting ahead of myself. What I want to do is escape out of that. I'm going to hit R, 90, 90 degrees. Snap it on. And then the next is going to be 45 degrees and so on. And when you get really good at this, it becomes very quick and easy to just kind of grab these and put them together. This is going to rotate by 30 degrees, snap there, grab this one, rotate by 15 degrees, snap there, and there it is. So you can see this is actually fairly quick. And in fact, if I can show you how quick this can go if I back up out of this. Hitting Control Z will simply undo, and it will remember, I think, about 20 steps. So I'm getting all the way back to one before I had cut this apart, and I'll show you. I can usually do these pretty quickly. Grab those. That was 180 degrees. Rotate 90 degrees. Grab this one. Rotate 45 degrees. Grab that one. Rotate 30 degrees. Grab this one. Rotate 15 degrees. And there they are. And I've got them all selected. Now I'm going to turn off the snap because I need to move this a little bit more precisely. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to just move it to wherever I want, and I'm going to make sure that it sits here and covers over those circles. Now unfortunately you can't see through it very well. If I hit A to deselect, now you can see that it's almost centered. So I'm going to reselect it and just move it over a tiny bit, deselect, Let's move it a tiny bit more. That's pretty good. So now if I come back up here and go back into Texture Paint, you'll see that, yes, we have these rims here, and it doesn't quite look right. Ideally, the rim should have been thicker. In fact, that's what I did in the with the fuel tanks that actually use this texture. The rim is quite a bit thicker than this. But we can actually fix that too. If I go back to edit mode, I'm simply going to grab the center polygon, right-clicking on it with the mouse once again, and hitting Control numpad plus 1, 2, 3 times so that I select the inside of the rim here. Now, because these vertices are all still connected together, what affects one will affect another. So what I'm going to do here is hit S to scale this. I'm going to hit Shift Z to constrain it to use everything except the Z-axis. And I'm going to scale, I'm going to hit this at, let's say, 0.9. I think that looks pretty good. That way it's 90% of the size that it was in that dimension, along that plane, I should say. Now if I go back to Texture Paint, you'll see that, these textures are now distorted. Unfortunately, that's going to be the case because I unwrapped it before I made this change. Now, I can either unwrap that again from scratch, or what I can do is select the entire model here by hitting A, come back in here, and I need to make sure I have not selected everything, because if I hit A here, you can see it's going to select both that panel and the dome. So hit A to unselect, and I'm just going to box select everything that's overlapped here. And I'm going to hit S to scale, Y for the Y-axis, and I'm going to say maybe, I don't know, 1.3, no, let's say 1.4. Okay. Come back over here, and it's still not quite right, but it's starting to look a little better. So I'm going to come back in here, scale 1. Scale Y 1. Scale Y 1.2. There we go. Let's try that. I'm going to move it a little bit. Hitting Tab to look at it again, and it's getting better. So you can see that this isn't quite perfect. The best thing to do would be to unwrap it again. What I can do is also scale it in the other direction a little bit if I need to. In fact, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hit Scale X and reduce it in the X axis a little bit, and that has the effect of widening the holes on the texture here. It's good enough for demonstration purposes right now, although I would not be satisfied with this one bit if this were an actual model I were working on. So now what we need to do is texture map the inside of the rim here. So what I'm going to do is the same trick again that I did earlier, where I right-click on a single polygon, hold down Control, and right-click on another one, right-click on another, right-click on another, until I have all of it. Now we're going to do an unwrap that's a little different than what I showed you earlier. What we're going to do is we're going to come over to Unwrap. We're going to select Cylinder Projection, and then we're going to look down in the options in this little tiny portion of the menu over here. What I want to do is Align to Object. Okay, now I have to zoom out of this a little bit. What you're going to see is that it has unwrapped the entire interior of that in a straight line, and the proportions are probably wrong. This isn't as bad as it'll usually get. Sometimes the proportions are significantly wrong. But what I'm going to do here is select all, and I'm going to scale Y, and I'm going to say 0.8 just to make it 80% as high as it was. Pretty simple. Now once again, I want to reuse a portion of the texture, so I'm going to have to open the texture up again. Usually this will remember what folder you were in. I'm not sure why it's misbehaving in that regard right now. I'm going to hit A to deselect all of these. I'm going to box select exactly half of them, put on the snap, Y, G, click. A, select, with B, Y, G, click. A, B, select, Y, G, click. A, B, Y, G, A, B, Y, G. Oops. Let me get that again. G, click. Oh, now I screwed one of those up. There we go. Y, G. Now, how did I know I screwed that up? If you look at these, there's always a dot in the center. If you see any of these dots appear around the edge, that means you forgot to hit Y, which detaches the polygons from their adjacent neighbors. If you grab a bunch of these and move them, and you didn't detach them first, then whichever one was just outside of your selection will be distorted, even if it means dropping it to a 0 width. Now I'm going to select all of these again, and I'm going to find a spot in the texture to use this. I'm going to go ahead and put it on, let's see, I got to turn off the snap. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put it on this. I'm going to use this kind of shaded gradient area. Now this square is vertical, but I want the shading to appear top to bottom, so I'm just going to hit R90 to rotate 90 degrees, hit enter, and I'm going to scale it up a little bit by pressing S and then using the mouse. Now once again, we're going to go back to texture paint, and you can see there we are. We've got a very plain rim on the inside, but it's textured. So now what we want to do is copy this entirety down to the bottom of our fuel tank. So the first thing I'm going to do is delete this polygon. You just hit the delete key, and I'm going to say faces. We're going to select up here, and once again we're going to hit Control numpad plus, 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 plus. Now that that's all selected, what I'm going to do is hit Shift D to duplicate. I'm going to hit Escape so that it's not trying to move it, and we're just done with the duplication. Now the duplicated polygons are all in the same place they started, but they're just occupying the same space as the existing polygons there. So now what I want to do is hit Control M. Sorry about that. What we're going to do is hit Control M to mirror, and then we're going to hit Z to make it happen on the Z axis. And because we have the pivot point selected as the 3D cursor, which is at the origin, this mirrors exactly to the bottom of our fuel tank here. I don't even need to move it. If I did need to move it, I can hit G and Z to slide it up and down, and I can get it mostly in place, and then I can turn snap back on, hit G, Z, and just select one of the polygons here, or I'm sorry, one of the vertices here, and it will snap right to where I need it. Perfect. However, you'll notice here that the coloration is a little different, and it's showing as a darker color because the normals got inverted. Anytime you mirror a piece, mirror any selection, the normals are now facing the opposite direction of what you're expecting. What that means is that these polygons will be transparent from the outside, which we don't want. Most of the time this can be fixed very easily by hitting Control N. Control N just recalculates normals for the selection, and this will reverse them back to where they needed to be. So once again, if we just go back into texture paint, you can see very briefly that yes, in fact, the bottom is textured the way we wanted it. So very simple. I'm going to go back to edit mode, and that primarily leaves the center here that we need to texture map. Now, there's a little bit of a nuance here that I want to mention before I move on. This is what we call a manifold mesh. Okay, and what that means is that all of the vertices are connected. There are no gaps. Nothing extends through each other. However, there's a caveat, and that is that the vertices at the top edge here actually are sharing. These are shared vertices that the polygons are using at the top here. Those are completely connected because we built it that way by extrusion. This bottom piece is not connected. I snapped it into place, but those vertices are technically only occupying the same space. In fact, if I go back to vertex selection here, you'll see that if I select it, that one lit up this line here, and but if I click again, I select the other vertex, and that has these three edges on it, but they're not the same vertex. So if I want them to be the same, what I can do is hit A to possibly hitting it twice, but I can hit A to select everything. I can go up to Tools, scroll this down a little bit, and there's a button here called Remove Doubles. I hit that, and it tells me remove 24 vertices. Now those 24 vertices were these 24 that are in this ring right here that I was talking about. Now I know that because I've been editing and I know that this happens, but this is something you just have to be aware of. You can these can get you in and out of trouble. Now one reason why you might want them to be detached is because, well, Blender automatically calculates the normals. Now you'll notice that in this fuel tank, if I go back to object mode for a moment, you can see that the edge split that we did still looks pretty good. All the shading on the outside of this looks great. But a problem comes in if this is not a perfect 90-degree 90-degree seam at the top here. If you have, like, say, a curved or raised lip that comes around the outside of the fuel tank, or have maybe one in the center in addition to that, what will happen is that sometimes the surface of the cylinder will get confused in terms of the direction of the normals, and you may get what is more like a spherical shading when you get it into the game. So one easy way to avoid that is I'm going to go back into edit mode, back to selecting by polygon, and I'm going to hit A to deselect, B to box select, and grab everything in the center here so that it is just the exterior of our fuel tank. I'm going to hit Y, and we're done. Y has deselected it. Now if I hit Control Z to undo that for a moment, you'll see that very little changed here. If I hit it again, we don't really notice much of a difference. If you see a difference, if I hit that and the shading in this grayish coloration that's still showing from the shading that's in here, if you see the shading change, then you know that detaching it was probably the right thing to do. This ensures that this is always treated as a cylinder, because that is all that is connected together here, is the cylindrical part. So now we need to unwrap this as well. Now I've already shown you how to do this with a cylinder, but we'll go through it again. We are going to go to Unwrap and select Cylinder Projection. Align to Object is still selected. And once again, we're going to come in here and we're going to see these are selected, right? Now if you'll notice, the aspect ratio of these is completely wrong. Now you can do the math yourself and figure out how high this should be relative to, you know, the height of this. More often than not, I end up just kind of eyeballing it. I can select all of this, and I know that this tends to make things a lot taller. I'm going to scale this down to about, I'm going to say 0.6. Or, I'm sorry. At first I have to undo the snap. Snap will prevent you from scaling properly. Scale Y. So I hit S, and then hit Y, and I'm going to say 0.6. Actually, I'm going to go down to, I'm going to hit a backspace and hit 5 so that it's 0.5. That looks a little bit better of an aspect ratio to me. Now we're going to have to open up our image again. It's unfortunate that this isn't remembering what I was doing here, but actually that's probably why. I was probably putting it in the file name field. So here's our texture again. Now something that I like to do in my fuel tanks and the like is I like to repeat portions of the texture around the model so that I can fit a lot of different colors into the same texture. It allows me to do a large number of fuel tanks in different sizes and different colors and get away with using only just the one texture. It saves us a lot of memory. So what I tend to do is split up the texture into groups of 3 or 4 polygons at a time. I'm going to go ahead and do this in 4s. Actually, I'll do 3s because in this size that's what I've been using with this particular texture. So first I'm going to deselect all with A, do a box select with B once again, select half our polygons, turn the snap back on, Y, G, enter, hit A, B, oops, B. I'm going to select only 4 of them this time, Y, G, click, A, B, Y, G, click. Alright, get them all selected, turn off the snap, move this to wherever we want. Let's say we want this fuel tank to be, I actually did go ahead and do it in 4 panels, but let's just go ahead and size it into here, and we'll make this a blue fuel tank. I'm going to come back up here, back into our texture paint, and there you are. Now you'll notice that there is no external rim visible here. It's very plain. We can fix that in a variety of ways. This is where it comes in handy knowing what to do after the fact, if you want to be able to make changes to things after you've already made something. I'm going to hit Tab to come back to edit mode. I still have all of these selected, and I'm going to go ahead and work with that. I'm going to extrude, and I'm going to hit escape because I want to scale. I'm going to hit S, and then I'm going to hit Z because I want to scale on the Z axis, and I'm going to hit 0.95. Now you're going to see that this did something a little funky. And all right, I'm going to hit enter. I have two sets of textures in the middle here. We can fix that pretty easily. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Y and move this out of the way. I'm going to hit G, Z, and I'm going to add 2 meters to it. Now it's out of my way. I can select what's in between here. These are the kind of phantom textures that I don't want. It was trying to make it a 3D object, so it put a set of extra textures on the inside. I'm going to hit the delete key and hit faces, and they are gone. Oops, I didn't quite select all of them. I'll do that again. Alright. I can select these guys again and hit G, Z, -2, and it's back in place. Alright. Now, what I did was I shrunk these a little bit, but I created a little bit of a rim, top and bottom. And what we can do is what I showed you earlier of selecting one, do Control-click, and we can select these a little bit at a time. Now you'll notice as more and more gets selected, it rotates a little bit crookedly. And it'll also change how your zoom functions. You can always hit the period key or the delete key on the numeric keypad to recenter based on your selection. Now that that's selected, I'm going to hit Shift and right-click to add a polygon down here, and then I can go back to doing Control right-click to select by a line here. Now that I have both groups selected, unwrap cylinder. We're still on align to object. Come here, we got them both. I want them both to be textured the same, so I'm going to grab one, and I'm going to move a little faster this time. Turn the snap back on. G enter. Then we grab half. YG enter. AB. YG enter. AB. YG enter. Okay, and I grab these. I'm going to rotate 90 degrees, and then I can put that on whatever I want. I'm going to turn off the snap. G to move, and I'm going to put it up on this portion of the texture. I'm going to zoom in on it, and you can see that it's just a nice gray strip that has some shading on it. Come back here, double check on the texture paint, and there we are. We have a little bit of a black rim above and below on the fuel tank. And it's that simple. We can, I'll show one more little thing that we can do if we want to that can kind of dress things up sometimes. We can take some of these textures, take some of these panels. Let's say we wanted to make them recessed. Let's say we want to have a recessed section on two sides. So I'm going to grab, like, say, 2 polygons here, scroll around to the other side, grab the same 2 over here. All right, I'm going to extrude, and then I'm going to hit escape. Now this is still selected on 3D cursor, so I'm going to hit. I'm just going to hit scale, and then I'm going to say, I don't know, maybe 0.9. Enter. And so now we have this neat little recessed area. It just appears on 2 sides of the fuel tank. If I go back to texture for just a moment, you'll see that the interior is untextured, but most of what already existed is still textured. Now what I can do is, with these guys still selected, I can just hit unwrap and do just a plain unwrap. And I can texture them with something else. I have all of these selected. I'm going to overlap one over the other, so I'm going to turn snap back on, put them together, unsnap, and then select all, and then I can scale them down, and let's just say put those in this black area up here. So we'll come up here and look again, and now that interior is black. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these tops and bottoms. Oops. Once again, I'm using the Shift key with the right mouse button to select these guys. And once again, I'm going to do a plain unwrap. And you'll see that they're rotated all sorts of different ways, but they're all the same size and shape. So I'm going to turn snap back on, A to deselect. I'm going to grab groups and snap them onto. I'm going to grab these polygons and snap them onto like-shaped ones. I'm Now here I'm going to have to take this, I'm going to rotate it by 180 degrees, and then put it together with G, and then snapping it together. Turn off snap, select all, and now I'm going to hit S to scale down and move it out of the way. Open our image again, and once again it is still not remembering my folder. So we have our texture. I'm going to rotate this a little further. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees, and I'm going to scale it down a little smaller. And what I'm going to do is move this one, I'm going to put this one in the green, just so that we have a different color to look at. And you can look in here and you can see that there we are. We have the green on the inside of those panels. I'm not sure why you'd want it to look this way, but it's an interesting thing to try nonetheless. Now, before we can put this into Blender, one last thing we need to do is we need a collision mesh. Unless you want to use the primitives in Blender, but unfortunately Blender does, I'm sorry, the primitives in Unity, but Unity does not give us a collider that is a cylindrical collider. The closest thing it gives us is a capsule collider, but that has spherical ends to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to object mode down here in the lower left. And while I'm in object mode, I'm going to go over to the left upper section here, and I want to create a cylinder. I select the cylinder. Now we want this to be different than what is being done for the fuel tank. So, the stock fuel tanks, what they use is a 12-sided cylinder for the collider. So we're going to put a 12 here. And then down here, the radius is already where we need it, and the height is already where we need it because it remembers it from what we did earlier. However, what I want to do is, I'm going to expand this for a moment. I want to scroll to the bottom of the cylinder add and go to the rotation area, and in the Z axis, put a 15. Now the reason for this is because unlike the fuel tank, and if I turn off the tank itself, in fact, hold on a second, we're going to rename this fuel tank. You just double click on this and it gives you a text edit. I'm going to call it fuel tank. I like to name both the mesh and the object the same thing, so that there's no confusion. I'm going to go back to the cylinder we just created. I'm going to turn off the fuel tank for just a split second. If you look at this, when we created our fuel tank, we wanted the vertices aligned with the X and Y axes. But for the collider, we want flat surfaces to point in those directions. And this just simply makes it easier when you're attaching things radially to the fuel tank in the KSP ship editor. Things work a lot more nicely if they're not sitting right on a vertex. So we want the flat edges in that direction. And that's very simple to do. We just do that 15-degree rotation, and we know it's 15 degrees because it's a 12-sided cylinder, and it had the edges and vertices pointing in these directions first. Each side is 30 degrees. We rotate it by half that. So now what we're going to do is just simply name this object collider. It can be named anything you want. However, again, to avoid confusion, I like to just call it collider. And what we're going to do is turn our cylinder back, our fuel tank back on. On the fuel tank, don't forget to come down here in the tools area. We're going to go to the materials tab here, and we're going to hit new, and then we're going to add a material, and we want it to be something that is specific to this particular fuel tank. So I'm going to call this demo fuel tank 1. Doesn't matter what you call it, as long as it's something fairly unique. Now, if you have a lot of parts that use the same texture file with the same specular settings and so on, then you'll want them to have the same material name as each other, and that way Unity will always remember those settings and you won't have to change them every single time. But for our purposes here in Blender, you can name it whatever you want. And now we have essentially a part that is ready to go into Unity, which is beyond the scope of this particular video. However, I'll show you the last few steps here. We're going to go back into object mode. And here's why I had you turn off the camera and the lamp earlier. You can just delete them if you like, but they might be useful later too if you want to do any renderings in Blender. While we're in object mode, what you can do is hit A to, of course, just like with the vertices or with the polygons, First time you hit it, it deselects everything. Hit it again and it selects all. Now you'll notice that these two mesh objects are both selected. I like to do it this way because now what I'm going to do is export this file. Simply say export. I prefer to use Collada files. I find it works well for most static objects. I often only switch over to other formats when I'm doing animations. Hit Collada. I say apply modifiers and selection only. Give it a file name like sample. And I'm just going to hit enter, and it is saved. And then what we're going to do is also do a save as here, and I'm going to again call it sample. And then hit enter. Every time I do a save with an export, I always export first and then hit save up here. It's a two-step process, and the reason why I do it in that order is because when you do an FBX export, for some reason Blender thinks that that is enough reason for your for your project to have changed and require being saved again before exiting. So I always do the actual Blender save after the export for that reason. And that's pretty much it. You now have a file that is ready to be imported into Unity, and then you can test it out in the game. There are plenty of other tutorials about this on the KSP forums, and I'm sure more will be created as needed, but I'm hoping that this at least gives you a little bit of an idea of how the workflow can go in Blender. For a simple part like this, I can work a lot faster than this without having to explain everything as I go, but all of these techniques can be used, the extrusion, the scaling, the repositioning, separating and joining vertices and so on. All of this can be used to make pretty much any of the kinds of parts that you've seen me make in KSP so far. I hope you've enjoyed this quick little blow through. It's very quick. I know it's not easy to follow, but I hope you find some value in it and can get some tricks or improve your own workflow if you're just getting started with Blender for KSP. Thanks, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Talk to you later. Okay, bye.